This
piggish for me tonight.
conference will now be recorded.
I'm doing later on the year. So I am kicking off with some of the material that I'll be using and feeling out the reactions that I get from you as to how solid it is. So by all means, feedback, but maybe at the end, so I can kind of get through the stuff I need to kind of present and need to look at. Yes, but your contribution at the end is very much welcome. So this, for anyone that remembers 2 years ago, is the second of a study I'm doing in Exodus. The first one of 2 years ago was on the topic of Moses and the theme of water. It was a Bible class, probably June 2023, and it kind of kickstarted me into a further study into the themes of the Exodus and into Moses. A lot of questions. Thus the title of this little series. This is going to be a 3-part Bible class. I think I'm on sort of every second week for the next month or so. So tonight we're going to be looking at, in particular, oh, hang on, never mind, let me just pull this up. In particular, the dry land. With the dry land, I've also mashed in other dry, earthy things, such as bricks and sand and stone. But we're going to start with dry land. So it's a nice segue, I guess, out of water from 2 years ago. If you can put yourself back there. A quick summary of the water that we covered. We looked at some of the obvious things in Moses' life to do with water. The parting of the Red Sea. Moses was carried in his ark on the waters of the Nile. We looked at the water that he poured out on dry land, which we'll get to that element of it as well, when he was before God in the wilderness, when God revealed himself to him. We looked at the water coming out of the stone on 2 occasions. We looked at the water at Mara and all of these wonderful occasions that water pops up and what that meant for the story of Moses. Tonight, we move on from that and we look at the contrast, because with dry land, we only have it with the absence, I guess, of water. So that is very much a nice sort of a way to develop the story of not only water, but obviously of looking into dry land. And I will preface before we start this whole set of 3 series studies. My approach to this study is one that I hope I can get you all on board with. I love the real intentionality of God's word. When I say intentionality, I mean that the stories that are left for us on record, I believe, have a lot of detail, and they are more than just place-filling detail. They are more than getting us from point A to point B. I believe God has left for us a lot of messages, themes, things we can learn from the narrative that on the surface is lovely and makes a remarkable story, but I believe there's more that we can unpack, as there is with a lot of God's scripture. There's a surface level, nice reading moment that we have with it, and then we start to dig deeper, whether that's into prophecy or into Psalms or whatever it might be. And so I've approached this study with that same sort of look at the intentionality of his word. So a quick example, for example, why did Moses leave Egypt? Because he killed an Egyptian, right? And he got called out for that, and he had to flee from the face of Pharaoh. That's getting us from point A to B. We needed Moses to get from Egypt into the wilderness so that he could face God in the wilderness and have that calling in that moment. Why that happened? It's an interesting story, but did it need to happen that way? There's many ways that it could have happened, many different ways, but that's the way that God worked in his life. That's the way that over centuries, the oral story preserved those particular details. And that's another big important factor to the intentionality. When this has been repeated over and over, these are the details that stuck. And these are these little moments in this detail that no doubt they put emphasis on when they said things like, and the dry land and the water, which we don't necessarily get in the text when they're connecting things. So I'll leave that intentionality a little bit there, but if you don't understand that, you'll see as we go that I'm going to pick on details that you may have just thought, well, that's just nice, it's nothing more. I'm going to go a bit deeper than that. Right, dry land, dry ground. Where's the first obvious place to start? Genesis chapter 1. So turn with me there. Before we get into Exodus, we will start with the story of creation. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 4. God saw that the light was good. So we're day 1 and we've created light. And at this point of day 1, God says, the story or the narrative or the explanation we have here is that God saw that the light was good. So God separated the light from the darkness. Verse 7, we're on the second day now. So God made the expanse and separated the water under the expanse from the water above it. It was so. I'm reading from the NET for anyone that is confused with my translation. So there we have a separation of light and a separation of water in days 1 and 2. Hand over your Bible. No more reading ahead. Day 3 is dry land. Very good. How is keeping your hand over the Bible? Robert, you're looking. I can see your eyes dipping down. I'm not looking at your Bible. How is the dry land created? So on day 1 and 2, we had separating of lights, separating of waters, day 2. Day 3 is therefore... Let's read it. Let's read it. So God said, let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear. It was so. So God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters he called seas. God saw that it was good. There's a difference. Days 1 and 2 are separations. Days 3, dry land, to create dry land required a separation. So our first little exploration into dry land. What is the difference? Has anyone used, and I'm going to dip out of my presentation even though we've only been in it for a quick second, Chris Delphin actually has designed this. Sync.Bible. Does anyone know of this product online? If you type sync.Bible into your browser, this is what comes up. Sync, S-Y. This is if you learn anything tonight, this is definitely what I would recommend you have to do. Sync.Bible, and that will bring you to a Bible application online. This is designed by, I don't know the name of the brother in the UK. I believe his last name is Dwyer. I think it's Tim. If anyone knows Tim B. Dwyer, I think it's Tim's brother, possibly. Anyway, Jamin 80 recommended it to me from the UK, and he knows. Sorry? Maybe Ben Dwyer? I don't know. Possibly. Anyway, this is an application that he's designed. It's like you would expect from a lot of Bible applications. It has different translations up here, and lots of, obviously, the whole book, all the chapters down here. The real fun thing for me, though, is the concordance side of it, and the real strength in the concordance. So, for the purposes of this, we're going to go to verse 7. We went through dry land, the waters that we gathered together. On the ESV concordance, you also have the King James concordance on this. Looks like Andrew's on his own one already. Are you enjoying that? It's good, eh? How good, eh? So if I go to gathered together, because that's what's happened. God called the dry land. Actually, we're not going to gather together because that's compounding the word. Dry land appear. Oh no, that's good. That's the same, is it not? Oh, that's that one. Yeah, slightly different from that one, but that's the root one. I think there is that gathered. So there we have on the left-hand side there all of the references straight away to that word. So gathered together, as we've seen, is the difference here in day 3 versus day 1 and 2. When we look at the meaning of this word, we see gather together, but other than that, it's look patiently, tarry, wait for, on, upon. And if we actually look through the different references to this word, we get to Genesis 49. I wait for your salvation, Job 9. It's actually the word hope. Let's go to Psalm 25. None who wait for you. Psalm there, wait for the Lord. Let's go Psalm 130. I wait for the Lord, my soul waits. Very much a expectation. We wait for you. Every other word since this gathered together is actually the word wait or hope sometimes.
So gathered together is not right.
So gathered together is the way the interpreters thought this should read. So when we reread this verse, if you want to look in your own Bible, God says in verse 9, let the water, no, sorry, where are we? Verse 7, 8, 10. God called the dry, no, there's one, verse 9. Let the water under the sky be waiting together, be waiting. So it's, yes, you're right. I mean, therefore, there's an obvious reason. I guess they clearly use it. It's definitely not the word separation. That is a different Hebrew word. But the word here is wait. When we actually think about what that actually means, that expectation, a lot of when we look at this word wait, it's all about an expectation. Waiting is an expectation, right? That's what you are doing when you're waiting. You're waiting for something because you're expecting something to happen. I'm waiting for Sophie to get home. I'm waiting for the Bible class to start. You are waiting for something to happen. When the dry land is formed, that is what's happening. There is a waiting is created. And that waiting is basically life. Because later on that day we see, not that day, later on the creation story, we see trees and things start to be, life begin. But in the first 2 days, there is no real possibility of life in the sense that you are, again, we don't want to get too heavy into the whole creation story, but tohu vavohu, there is just chaos and disorder. And those first 2 days of separation are really just about trying to create some order. And the third day is more about creating a hopefulness or creating that awaiting for life to start. Time check. Okay, good. Feel free to write down questions or comments and we can talk about that towards the end. So, with a direct comparison then to, and so yeah, sync.bible, feel free to explore that in your own time. With a direct comparison then to, here's my days of creation. Light is created day 1, and then we have the waters are separated, and then day 3 we have this idea of gathering together. That land can create a hopefulness or some sort of waiting or expectation for life to begin. And so when we think about the story then of the Exodus, and that is the word, by the way, is kavar, for this gathering together. When we think about the story of the Exodus, the most obvious story of dry land creating a waiting hopefulness is when the dry land appears in Exodus and chapter 14. If you want to turn there, we're done with the Exodus, with the creation story for now. Exodus chapter 14 and verse 21 and 22. Moses stretched his hand toward the sea, and the Lord drove the sea apart by a strong east wind all that night, and he made the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. So the Israelites went through the middle of the sea on dry ground, the water forming a wall for them on the right and on their left. And so this dry land represents this waiting as they leave, this hopeful new life as they leave to go to the promised land. They walk through on dry land. This repetition, I believe, is important. Again, looking at the intentionality of the language, I believe that's real throwback. When the references to dry land are very few, there may only be one more, which we're about to look at, and I'll fix that up in my notes when I do this another time, that when there's only a few references, then we can assume that those should link together. And really, Genesis doesn't talk about dry land again. It's really just a couple of times in this Exodus story that this dry land appears again. So, we have then, sandwiched in between this story the story of creation and the story of the Israelites going through on dry land and that new hope of going to a promised land, we have another story of dry land, and that is in Exodus 4 and verse 9. and we've talked about it briefly already. So Moses is deep into this conversation with God around the identity of God and what God is asking him to do. And by 4 verse 9, we have already had 2 signs that God has given to him. This is the 3rd sign. Refresher, the first 2 signs are throw your staff down on the ground and it becomes a snake. And Moses asked to pick up the snake by the tail, which, by the way, I think is an intentional bit of detail. Why pick the snake up by the tail? It's not necessarily the obvious place, and it's not the reference to a part of the snake that we're normally used to in terms of the story so far of the Bible. Second point is, or the second sign is the leprosy. Put your hand in your cloak, separate it from yourself, put it back in, and you are healed again of that leprosy. Third sign, as we read here in verse 9, and if they do not believe even these 2 signs, and when we're talking they, we're talking the elders of Israel, not the Egyptians, but Moses is going to present himself to the elders so that they might believe that God is with him, that he is this chosen leader of the people out of Egypt. If they do not believe even these 2 signs or listen to you, then take some water from the Nile and pour it out on the dry ground. The water you take out of the Nile will become blood on the dry ground. And so these 3 signs, again, lovely little signs, and it makes for a good Sunday school play. But looking further into the detail, what can we take from these 3 signs? And we'll dip into serpents and leprosy very quickly here. I believe the serpent, as most of you probably can think back to where we were previously in the beginning story of Genesis, is related to sin and temptation. When Moses asked to throw it on the ground and then pick it up, there was some association there with sin. What is the sin that Moses has caused? We talked about that right at the beginning. He's killed an Egyptian some years before. When we're talking about who he's showing this sign to, by the way, he's showing these signs to the elders of Israel who, do you think they've forgotten what Moses fled for? Moses fled for his life because he committed a crime of killing someone. So when you are before these elders of Israel who are now leading the people, the story of Moses fleeing was probably widely known that he fled because he had murdered an Egyptian. So the first thing is this acknowledgement of some sort of sin on the ground that he shows, that he consequently, in the next chapter, I think, or at the end of chapter 4, shows these signs to the leaders in Israel. The next one is leprosy, that he might be cast out of the camp, that he might be excommunicated from the community, as you would if you had leprosy. But in this case, the sin meant he needed to leave and be separated from the community. So then we get to the dry land of sign 3. If they don't believe these 2, then maybe we'll believe this one. Water poured out into dry land. Not necessarily that any more miraculous, but for some reason it should be more convincing in some way. But what's maybe the convincing part about the 3rd sign of water turning to blood on dry land? We have this reversal of water and land, where land should have already been gathered together away from water, and we're having this reversing of creation, but then we've also got it turning into blood on the land. For me, I think this represents some sort of sacrifice in the moment of this dry ground, some sort of repentance maybe, which we expect of sacrifices, some sort of acknowledgement to God as well, which comes with sacrifice, but certainly some sort of sacrifice where blood is spilt on the dry land. And again, why would these people in Israel, these elders, need to see this sign? Because they need to know that perhaps there had been a forgiveness of Moses for that sin. And when we echo, I guess, that with the meaning of this waiting or expectation, I'll leave your minds to kind of play on that word of well, it's not dry land is not the same word, sorry, that we looked at before, so you don't need to think about Okay. Just like that, we're actually going to move on from dry land. And we're going to move on to bricks. This is a story in the Exodus where I love in terms of intentional detail, and again makes for a really good story and gets us from point A to B, but what more is there to it? So let's turn this up. Exodus in chapter 5. So we have Moses now, he's returned. If you want to reference where Moses shows these signs, it's at the end of chapter 4 and verse 30. Aaron spoke these words to the Lord, had spoken to Moses, and did the signs in sight of the people, and the people believed. So that's the end there of chapter 4, him doing those 3 signs. Then we have Moses straight into his first dialogue with Pharaoh. I'll read from verse 1 of chapter 5. Afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, has said. Release my people so that they may hold a pilgrim feast to me in the wilderness." But Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him by releasing Israel? I do not know the Lord. I will not release Israel." And they said, "The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Let us go a 3-day journey into the wilderness so that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God, so that he does not strike us with the plague or the sword." And so Moses returning as an 80-year-old, I'm going to unpack the story, these 3 verses in another talk, because what's unusual about this is Moses tries one angle, Pharaoh says, "Why would I do that?" And Moses tries another angle. The second time he's like, "I'm going to tweak here. I'm not going to call him the same name, this God, anymore. I'm going to say the God of Israel rather than his name that I've got in the desert, Yahweh. And I'm going to suggest a 3-day little festival." Anyway, we're going to look at that in another study. But what we find after these 3 verses is back and forth, and then we come down to verse 5. And I didn't write down. Oh, yeah, well, let's read from verse 5. Pharaoh was thinking, "The people of the land are now too many, and you are giving them rest from their labor." That same day, Pharaoh commanded the slave masters and foremen who were over the people, "You must no longer give straw to the people for making bricks, as before. Let them go and collect straw for themselves. But you must require of them the same quota of bricks that they were making before. Do not reduce it, for they are slackers. That is why they are crying, 'Let us go sacrifice to our God.' Make the work harder for them, the men, so they will keep at it and pay no attention to lying words." Interesting story. Pharaoh now is frustrated to the point that he actually wants to punish the people for the things that Moses has suggested God has said. Now, this whole story about bricks for me was always unusual, because why did God require the Israelites, his people, to suffer more at the hands of Pharaoh and of the people of Egypt before bringing them out of Egypt? What was the purpose of this? This just seems cruel. And if you are someone that likes to be a skeptic of the Bible, which none of you I'm sure are, but you would look at this and go, why is God so cruel? Why would he make the people who have been enslaved for so many hundreds of years, why would he create more pain at this moment? Quick few facts about bricks, just because you might be interested. Bricks, we're talking, a good few millennia ago. What were they using bricks for? And what was the purpose of these bricks? And what was the purpose of straw? Let's look at that first. So why is straw and bricks? Has anyone thought about that? Why? It's a big deal that they've got to go collect straw, but why? What's the purpose of straw? The first one was, it was a binding agent. So it actually helped to bind the clay or the mud together, and it actually reduced shrinkage of the bricks, stopped any sort of cracks forming, or prevented as many cracks forming. We have rebar in concrete these days, metal bar, and the straw in some sense was kind of having that binding effect, but also like rebar, it was a strength and durability. It helped that fibrous nature of the straw helped to increase the tensile of each brick. It also created a faster drying brick, because there was less sort of dense mud and clay that they were probably dredging out of the Nile, There was less of that. There was more sort of air pockets and more less of the dense stuff. More air could kind of circulate and dry the brick quicker rather than just a slodgy mess that would maybe take too long to dry. And then lastly, it made them lighter. Obviously, that straw is lighter than mud, and so you have a lighter brick created by this. So stronger, lighter, faster to manufacture, dried quicker, etc. Less clay needed. Yep, possibly true. Yep. Also, there's a thought, again, this is a bit of a side point, but they actually use straw to separate the clay from their hands. If you imagine really sticky clay and how that kind of just gets gunky, you need that sort of dry, sort of papyrusy type of material to kind of try and separate it from your hands, almost like flour when kneading dough, right? So that was another potential quality to using this this straw that Pharaoh was withholding. This is a hieroglyph from supposedly this sort of era. In fact, there's a clearer one. I found someone that has been redrawing these in a clearer form, which is lovely. In this picture, we have a god named Meskehenet. And Meskehenet, if I'm saying that correctly, is this god here. She's a woman, and she is a goddess of childbirth and a protector of the birthing house. She is personified with with a birthing brick in this picture, and many of the pictures you find of this Meskehenet is on a birthing brick or some sort of, or is holding herself up on birthing bricks. Birthing bricks, never given birth, but apparently it's useful. This was for the Israelites to use as well, supposedly, as the Egyptians. When you gave birth, you had these supporting bricks that you would hold yourself on, and those were the birthing bricks, and they were associated with, and I guess Meskehenet, the goddess for the Egyptians, was someone that also kind of helped deliver the baby because of her power being within these birthing bricks. Also, just another god to bear in mind as we look at this story. There's another god called Khnum, who was a creator god who was believed to have fashioned human bodies from clay that was on a potter's wheel. And that clay was from the Nile, which he was also supposedly a god of, was of the Nile. All of this may seem irrelevant to the story of bricks, but when we're talking about something so long ago and trying to get the mindset of Israelites who lived in the land, Egyptians who followed these gods, we have to get in the mindset of, on a daily basis, these Egyptians were trying to appease the gods that they had created, that they feared. They were trying to make sure that nothing bad happened to them by making sure they did everything possible, checked boxes, just like the Pharisees probably walked around with a copy of the law. I imagine the Egyptians walked around with a copy of the gods and their functions and what it was required to appease them. And so when we talk about things like bricks, we don't just talk about bricks, we talk about the gods of the bricks. That's what Pharaoh, or the people saying next to Pharaoh, are probably advising him on. Oh yeah, if you say to do the bricks, the god of the bricks will do blah. So it's useful to get in the mindset when trying to mine the detail out of the story of what the Egyptians were thinking. So not so unnecessary. I still think, I guess, there is an element of what is the point here. Obviously, the story introduces Pharaoh to God, and this is all sort of just the introduction to this what I would call labored time of Israel coming out of the land of Egypt. But it causes this suffering to begin with, as we've spoken about, this enmity between Moses, the Israelites, the slave masters. There's now this tension which wasn't there before as much as it is now. In fact, if we turn to what the people say towards the end of the chapter, because the Israelites, there we go, verse 15, the Israelite foreman, so this has all happened. Now this burden falls on the Israelite foreman in verse 15. The Israelite foreman went and cried out to Pharaoh, "Why are you treating your servants this way? No straw is given to your servants, but we are told make bricks. Your servants are even being beaten, but the fault is with your people." Pharaoh replied, "You're slackers." The Israelites saw the trouble, and then he goes to Moses in verse 20. No, he doesn't, 21. And they said to them, "May the Lord look on you." Is that the right verse? May the Lord look on you and judge you because you've made. Yes. Israelites speaking to Moses and Aaron say, "May the Lord look on you and judge because you have made us to stink in the opinion of Pharaoh and his servants, so that you have given them an excuse to kill us." So they're cross that Pharaoh is obviously now angry with them, because of what Moses has done. And so that's something that's been created in this story. The thing that I think this story represents, and the thing that needed to happen in this instant, is not just sheer pain for these people, but it is to separate the people from Egypt and Pharaoh. This is the first separation that these people needed, was this labor with these bricks. Does anyone know, hands up if you are aware of the Stockholm effect or the Stockholm syndrome? A few of you, great. 1973, many centuries later, there was a bank robbery in Stockholm, capital city of Sweden. A man, Swedish name, came in apparently in disguise. He dyed his mustache and his eyebrows black. I guess all Swedish people are usually blonde. He dyed parts of his body. He put on some sort of fake makeup, and he stormed into a bank, and he took 4 hostages. I think it was 3 women and 1 man. Over 6 days, he held these people hostage while the police of Stockholm negotiated, tried to work out ways, tried to maneuver them into different parts of the bank, they offered obviously supplies, so they were actually kept alive. But what happened over the course of this, of him holding these hostages, and this is a photo, at this point of the hostage, I think it's about day 5, the police have actually got them because they'd fallen asleep in the vault. This is the vault of the bank. They'd fallen asleep in there, and the police had rushed in and closed and locked the door of the vault, so they were at least contained to just the vault. Then they started drilling holes in the ceiling of the bank, so that they could still pass some things down to them. This is actually a photo of them picking a camera through the hole to take a photo of them. And so here we have the hostages, and we have the man, and there's not too many young people here, but it was pretty grim. These are nooses that the hostages would have to have around their necks to show that this man meant it. You know, these were hostages that he intended to take to the death or whatever. This is just a bank robbery at this point though, right? The peculiar thing about this bank robbery though is that after only, I think it was only after the first day or so, when the police started to negotiate and actually started to make tracks into the bank, and I think the first police officer came in, one of these hostages spotted and said, "Don't shoot, don't shoot," causing this man to notice and quickly fire back and scare the police officer off. From then, a whole lot of things happened where these hostages started to become on the side of the hostage taker. And the whole idea of Stockholm Syndrome is that under some circumstances, when you are bound by some person or some authority, and even though it's unreasonable, you start to sympathize, you start to lean towards their point of view, and even start to love your captor. And this has been well studied as a result, because what happens after that? One of these women fell in love with the man. They actually had, on the day 6, they started pouring gas through these holes to kind of gas them out, and they had, paramedics on standby waiting to kind of treat these people at the same time. He basically surrendered as he was getting kind of, tear gassed, I guess, and said, "Okay, I give up, I give up." They called to these hostages and said, "Come out, you're free to go, come out." And they said, "We're not coming out, you're going to hurt him." So they were prepared to stay behind and make sure this man was safe. They had what is now known as Stockholm Syndrome. When we look at the story of Exodus, and when we look at the Israelites and their hundreds of years of slavery, I just wonder if what this story is trying to convey is that Israel needed some separation for the love they'd kind of built up for the life they had in Israel, for the love of their captives. And now they seem fairly shocked that now they're actually having to do work that is kind of hurting them, and work that all of a sudden it seems all a bit unreasonable. And they're blaming Moses. They're blaming the police officer, which these people blamed the police officers for a lot after this happened. So what I think is happening here is a bit of Stockholm Syndrome. There's more to the story as well. When we look at the state of what Israel were in and why perhaps the story needed to happen, what do we know about what they had? They were slaves. Slaves by nature have no rights, right? They are property. They are owned by someone, and they give up all their rights when they become a slave at whatever stage. But they owned their own land. Let's turn to Genesis in chapter 47. Genesis in 47, Joseph is in Egypt at this point, and there's obviously a lot of connection as to what happened with Joseph and his entering and departure by death from Egypt. But something he did towards the end of his life, in verse 11 of chapter 47. So Joseph settled his father and his brothers. He gave them the territory in the land of Egypt, in the best region of the land of Ramses, just as Pharaoh had commanded. Joseph also provided food for his father and his brothers and his household according to the number of the children. So Joseph gave, with Pharaoh's blessing, or as Pharaoh had commanded, they had land. My translation says Ramses, others might say Goshen. Right, and later on in the Exodus story, we hear about them being in Goshen, or wanting to. This is where they wanted to go to worship God, was in Goshen, which is where they lived. So they already had land. They were slaves, but they had land. This is up in the east of the Nile Delta, and it was great land, fertile land. Another reason that this bricks without straw story might be required is because they had land. They were promised land by God. Had they been confused as to what land they were going to receive? And with this land that they had in possession for hundreds of years now, things were going okay. And perhaps they'd even confused the story of the promises of where that land was to be, and maybe, the dialogue, that had been exchanged was, yep, we have our land, we have a part of the promise. And so, again, I think that's just part of the complex nature of these stories as to why things happen. I think the Stockholm Syndrome around them loving their captors and them already having land which they were promised, but not the right land, is why they needed this. There's another reference to bricks, and there's not many in this first in the Torah, in the first few books of the Bible. One of the real striking ones is Exodus in chapter 20. Exodus in chapter 20. So they're out of the land. They're out of Egypt, obviously, by a wee way now. And in chapter 20 and verse 24, we have this as Lord, that God has told Moses to tell the people, "You must take for me an altar made of earth, and you will sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your cattle. In every place where I cause my name to be honored, I will come to you and I will bless you. If you make me an altar of a stone, you must not build it out of stones shaped with tools, for if you use your tool on it, you have defiled it." So, moving on to stones at this point, but we're going to move back into bricks slightly. Here we have kind of a contrast to bricks, but a similar tool. We have a stone that is unshaped with any tool being used as an altar, compared to a brick which is very much shaped and is man-made. So there's a contrast here between these bricks that they're making in Egypt and the stone that God's asking them to use as an altar, a sacrifice before him, a real mediating sort of point between God and the people, in something that was very much a created thing by God, not a created thing by man. The last thing we want to look at to do with bricks then is Genesis in chapter 11. And this is where I think those two stories tie together nicely. Genesis in chapter 11, we have again a bit of detail which we might gloss over without this look through Exodus. Looking at verse 3. This is the story of Babel, yeah? So the people are about to build Babel. Then they said to one another, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They had bricks instead of stone and tar instead of mortar. It's interesting that we look on the story of Babel and we kind of go, it didn't seem terribly bad maybe what they were doing. They're building a thing. Is it such a big deal? But I do wonder if this brick was not what God wanted. Again, this brick was then represented later on in Egypt as this man-made thing to kind of create something before God, but rather he wanted his created things that were already provided in stone. So again, we think of Exodus 20 and verse 24, when the altar is to be of stone, not to be hewn out, not to any tool to profane it. Other stones that we have throughout the rest of the Bible, again, not touched by any man, not shaped by anyone. Daniel in chapter 2, we have gold, silver, and we end with a big stone. Daniel chapter 2 and verse 34. I'll turn up my translation. Daniel chapter 2, the vision of Nebuchadnezzar. Again, a well-known story. And verse 34, we've gone through this vision of all of the different layers of the statue. And then in verse 34, you were watching as a stone was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its iron and clay feet, breaking them in pieces. The iron, clay, and the bronze and silver, gold broke into pieces without distinction and became like chaff, no traces. But the stone that struck the statue became a large mountain that filled the entire earth. This large stone that was not touched by any human hand. Other references to stone as we get into the New Testament, we have a cornerstone. Again, one that was integral to the life of Israel. And the last verse we'll look at to do with the stone and to do with this section is 1 Peter in chapter 2 and verse 4, because this is where it applies to us. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 4. And it reads, "As you come to him, a living stone rejected by men, but in the sight of God, chosen and precious, you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For it stands in Scripture, behold, I am laying in Zion a stone, a cornerstone, chosen and precious, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. So the honor is for you who believe, but for those who do not believe, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone." So we have this full picture now maybe of what it is to be a brick and what it is to be a stone. And I believe we are called not to be shaped by humans, not to be shaped with straw and under the duress of humans, be dredged up out of Nile rivers, but instead to be hewn stones not by man's work, but by God's work. And that is the thing that we cultivate within us, is that character of God, that thing that's untouched by humans, really, is that character of God, that rock shape is what we want. Okay, I'll take the last 5 minutes, but it's good to know where we've got to. All right, the last story we'll get to, and we may cover the final story in the next session, even though it's kind of created with this. It was going to be holy ground, because I think that's an interesting story. Why was the ground holy? But the last one we actually end with is the story we've already talked about a couple of times. He hid him in the sand. This one's an interesting one. Well, let's turn back to Exodus then, because that is the study. Exodus chapter 2, and I'll commentate as we get there. So Moses, a man of 40 years, has now killed an Egyptian because he's tried to stop two Israelites quarreling. Sorry, no, that's the next day. He's tried to stop an Egyptian who is giving some sort of reprimand to an Israelite, and in some flashpoint, Moses has killed the Egyptian, and as the verse says, he buries him in the sand. I don't have the verse here, again, for my notes purposes, I'll fix that up. But we know that he buries him in the sand, and then it's the next day that he's called out by two Israelites to say, well, you're going to kill us like you killed the Egyptian. I've always thought it's interesting, a little detail like that, like he buried him in the sand. The actual reading, if you read those couple of verses, let's make sure we've got them. Who's got the actual verses we need? Verse 12. He looked this way and that, and saw that no one was there, and then he attacked the Egyptian and concealed the body in the sand. When he went out the next day, there were two Hebrew men fighting. Why are you attacking your fellow Hebrew? Verse 14, who made you a ruler and judge over us? So you plan to kill me like you killed the Egyptian. One weird thing about this, which I haven't answered, which I may as I continue these studies, he really went to an effort to make sure no one's watching. It says there, he looked this way, he looked that way, strikes the Egyptian, buries him. It's the next day, they already know. I just think it's a really interesting bit of detail. He's gone to an effort that no one should see what's happened, but it's the next day and all of a sudden people just know. Just two random people that are having a quarrel, they just know. It's not even the Egyptians who maybe the master of the person that's been killed, maybe they'd know, but it's two Israelites. They know the very next day. I don't know why it's so purposeful that Moses tries to conceal this whole thing, but then he's found out by two random Israelites the next day. Anyway, why sand? Why bury him in the sand? Why is that relevant? Sand is an interesting thing through Scripture. As we've been back in Genesis, we're not going to dive back into these verses because I think you know them well. Genesis 22, the promise to Abraham on the mountain just before a burnt offering of a ram. Your people will number the sand of the seashore. Your people will number the sand of the seashore. That promise is repeated to Jacob in chapter 32 of Genesis. Your people will number the sand of the seashore. There is a reference, which I won't get into at this point, but Joseph collected food like sand for when he was collecting food because of the great famine that was coming, and that were numbered like the sand, essentially, in chapter 41 of Genesis. So we have these kind of great promises involved with sand, and then this other one that revolves around just a large measure. Then we get to this, and he's burying someone in the sand. Quite a different use for sand that we've had. That's the only three occasions we've had for sand in all of Genesis record, is those three occasions. Two promise references and one multitude of food. It seems, the act seems a little bit sort of offbeat, I guess, in terms of the promise to Abraham that you would use sand in this way, if potentially, like a very visual thing that, again, is being repeated to the people, and he's using it completely out of context of what God has used sand for. One thing that I think answers maybe the question of, and I forgot, I'll have to remember, there's my stone. There's my pile of sand. One thing that I think may answer why this little intentional, I believe, detail is added there, that Moses buries a man in sand, is Moses is trying to do something at this point. There must have been some inkling to be in that flashpoint that I need to do something for my people. So he's felt some sort of calling. He's not had it directly from God, as far as we know, but he's felt some sort of calling to all of a sudden intercede for his people, and so something's happened there with the murder. God, as I believe, was not happy with that. And those three signs in the wilderness that he showed the Israelites were to do with repentance and showing that God had forgiven him with this new calling, and he was a worthy candidate for the task at hand to lead the people out of Egypt. What God does, though, with the sand of the seashore next, the very next reference of sand that we have is in Exodus 14. And this is where we'll wrap up tonight. Exodus chapter 14. And looking at verse 30, we have just crossed the Red Sea, the Sea of Reeds, and all its victoriousness. And we have in verse 30, so the Lord saved Israel, big summary verse here, on that day from the power of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the shore of the sea. When Israel saw the great power that the Lord had exercised over the Egyptians, they feared the Lord and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. Two real different stories and very much bookends of this whole story. The first one is really the beginning of Pharaoh, of Moses and his journey to become the leader, the second greatest leader of Israel ever, right, after Christ. Right at the beginning, we have him bury a man in sand. And right here, we have God showing how sand is used in the promise of people to come out of Egypt, is that they are strewn across the sea, the seashore. And that seashore word's used in those promises as well as the sand of the seashore. And so I think the imagery sort of moves from this Moses kind of doing this hidden, this incomplete justice work to this public and divine work of God, and all to do with that motif of sand. And again, in contrast, no Israelite is happy with what Moses has done on the first occasion. And here we have, when Israel saw the great power of the Lord that he had exercised over the Egyptians, they feared the Lord. They certainly didn't fear the Lord after Moses' action with sand on the first occasion. The only two references to sand in this passage that we have in Exodus. So, I will leave that there for tonight with dry land, bricks. So it's dry land, bricks, stones, and sand. It's a lot of just dry earth type substances. Maybe that sort of doesn't roll off the tongue so well, but yes. Yes, by all means, some discussion, and I will be taking some notes because any feedback on how that sort of presents as some themes as well. Yes.
It's related, but it's not really deeply related. But the bricks they made for the city of David,
Yes.
the Tower of David, they made brick. They stuck them together with bitumen.
Yeah.
Now they used that instead of mortar,
Mm-hmm.
and mortar must have been around. It must have hit something that blocked the bricks together. The problem with bitumen is you put it under heat, it will go all soft.
Right.
So you could say kind of the thing that they built wasn't stable.
True. Yep. And bricks were used in kind of more like housing and things. They weren't used for proper long-lasting temples and stuff. So yeah, there's very much a different use for them in terms of longevity. And obviously the pyramids are not brick; they are sandstone. Like there's no way a brick made out of mud would last.
That's not entirely true. So Tower of David says, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly.
Mm-hmm.
So that is baked bricks. And
Yep.
we have the surviving bricks from Babylon. You can go to sort of the museum. Because they're baked bricks. Okay?
Yep. True. Yep.
Compared to mud brick, which is used
Yes.
for housing, which just takes ordinary soil. Now here's an interesting thing. When you do baked bricks, you've got to separate the sand out of the soil.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it requires a lot of water, but you use water to separate the sand out of the soil to create clay, because you require clay to create baked bricks.
Yeah.
Mud bricks, not so much. You can just mix it with straw, and the straw will do the binding so that you can use a product as long as it doesn't get wet altogether. So just some interesting.
Yeah. Development on that, yeah.
That's through that.
Yeah, and they've found. I mean, archaeology's found bricks with straw, bricks without straw that they kind of call from that era. Who knows if they're, the actual bricks that Israelites were called to make.
The other thing about the sand and that bearing the Egyptians,
Mm.
now, I mean, what, it must be explained to us, just being Christian, I mean, if you buried them in the sand, what was the other option? You
Mm.
probably only had the sand. Now, the thing is, the properties of sand, I would think, because we know it's, I mean, the wind, can pick it up and blow it away. And, it would seem to me that you almost get a sense, well, was Moses, did he bury them there temporarily, thinking, I might have to go back later and bury them somewhere else? Because I would have thought he would have said, he's going to be discovered. All that is going to be required is an east wind to come through and blow the great open. So,
Sure.
It'd be interesting to know what was going through Moses' mind. Because I know that it was the next day, wasn't it?
Yeah. Very next day, and two unrelated people in some way, like just word got round. Yeah, right. Yeah.
So Moses had gone back to there.
Yeah. Oh, right. Yeah. Good. Yeah.
So I was thinking that Moses, did he go back there first? To be crude about it, to actually dig up the Egyptian.
Yeah.
And put it somewhere else. I don't know.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
Of course, it might have been the guy that was the Israelite that was saved. Might have just what happened. It was a bit of he killed everybody.
There's I've heard that before, which would be pretty wild, but yeah. Yeah, because it's no small thing to. Well, yeah.
With bare hands.
But then if I take my grandkids under the beach and say dig a hole, they dig a hole pretty quick.
So then Moses dragged the body to somewhere where there was deep sand. Because most of the land that they would have been on wouldn't have been like beach sand all over the whole country.
No, it's desert sand, yeah.
He may have dragged him.
To a little ditch or something first, yeah.
We also know him as Moses the Hebrew. He would have looked like an Egyptian.
Mm.
So that, the witness saw him, obviously was a Hebrew, and would have gone back and told them this guy was an Egyptian.
Mm.
What are you going to do? Come and be a ruler over us?
Mm.
Because they wouldn't have recognised him as one of them. Just be an Egyptian saving a Hebrew, and then you're going to come and infiltrate us and be a leader over us.
Yeah. Yeah.
And some dry land you didn't use was when they came out of the ark.
Dry land out of the ark? It's not the same word, I don't think. But yes, I mean, yeah, what is it actually?
It said the water had dried off the land.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, again, you've got to cut that new life sort of moment. Yeah. Yeah.
The water had dried up from the earth. Chapter 8, verse 13.
Yeah.
Because when you talked about another story, I thought you were going to say about it.
Oh, right. Yeah.
There was a dry land where they crossed back with the ark.
Across the Jordan. No, but that's an interesting one, and I have it kind of, it's one of those ones where the stuff kind of starts to not spiral because they're all relevant, but where do you kind of cap the significant ones? But yeah, no, I have, yeah, that is good.
As far as your water gathered together in one place.
Yes.
In the waiting area.
Yeah.
It's quite a neat thought, I think. Is that if you have an overcast day, you've got the water above, and it's just sort of basically spread out.
Mm-hmm.
And there's generally no chance of rain. It's just overcast.
Yeah.
But if you gather all that water together in one place, make a cloud, and it's got the potential, it's waiting to release its load.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's your contrast between the water being gathered together and waiting.
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely something in that language, which again, I think is intentional to change it, because you're separating the land from the water feels like a good thing to do, but it's gathered together, which is very different. So,
I like the way you drew out the brick and stone and the difference between brick is hewn by man, and stone is hewn by God, and then the relationship between them.
okay, good. I'll leave that in.
Creation, isn't there, with the Red Sea? The separation of water and dry land is quite, ever noticed that?
Yeah,
It's quite strong.
yeah,
Connected to the creation.
very much. Yeah, yeah. And it's the same sort of life-giving dry land that, yeah, that needs to happen for there to be life. The other word, so obviously we looked at that word for wait or hope, to wait or hope the land, that whole gathering together. The other word, if you are interested, is badal. So separate is the word badal from days 1 and 2. Not going to get into that because it just gets too much of a, rabbit hole-y. But the next reference to that word of separating lights from darkness, separating waters from water, is actually Exodus 26, which is talking about the veil separating the holy from the most holy, which is really interesting. It's the very next reference. And then there's a whole lot of references around separating to do with sacrifices, which again is that sort of, creating holiness, I guess. So yeah, there's an interesting reference there, but again, that was kind of too rabbit hole-y to go down too much into for tonight. So next time, I will either do a study, which I think is 2 weeks away. We'll either look at firstborns and the theme of firstborns through this, or we will look at the plagues as a set and look at intentional detail on the plagues and some of that dialogue and what's going on there, some of the stuff we might have missed. And answering 2 questions, actually. We'll answer 2 questions on that. Why 10 plagues? That's a lot. Like if you are God and you are going to design a way that your people can come out of Egypt, does your mind think 10 plagues? That's the right amount. That's the sweet spot. What is required of those 10? And then the other thing that I think is always a fun one to look at is the hardening of the heart, the free will, a really challenging question to sort of answer of Pharaoh. And again, unpacking the questions that plague the Exodus. Okay, thank you very much. I'm not sure what's actually on next week, but I think I've got a week off and then I'm back on Sisters class. Okay, so it'll be the 20th-ish, 19th of May maybe, but next week for Sisters class. Good. Volunteer to close with prayer. Thanks, Phil. All right, bow heads.
Father in heaven, thanks for your love and care. For us here in peace and safety this night to share in Bible class together, to consider the elements of the Exodus, those intentional words which have been placed there, and try and decipher the hidden meanings which you have left for us to find out. We know that it is your glory to seal a matter, and it's our honour to search it out. And I pray that you will continue to reveal yourself and your Son through the word to us as we wait for the day of our Lord's return. We thank you for the time we spend in each other's company tonight, especially around the supper, which we thank you for. We ask also for your guiding blessing to go with us as we leave to our individual homes, to grant us your grace, that nothing may befall us which is not according to your will. So we offer our prayer, giving you our thanks and praise in the name of our Lord, for yours is the kingdom, and power, honour, and glory.
Amen.